of Clyn Island. What made you spend 10 years researching a publication on Louisburgh?
Well, as I said, when I started working here, I was intrigued. I hadn't known about the Houston or Loudon farms, and I was intrigued by that story. And when you're working, you have lots of things on your mind, and you don't have the time to give to research a story like this. And it was at that stage when I retired that I decided I'd look into this and see how did these farms come about, and how did the people get back to the west, as they say here.
Number two, you have some great research, some great photographs many people may have never seen before. Obviously, people dug very deep into trunks and suitcases and everything else to get some of the great photographs. When you approach people with this project, was there a general positive? Were people mixed? Were people said, let sleeping dogs lie, famine and all that way back? Or was there 100% encouragement?
Everyone was enthusiastic about telling the story. I didn't feel any. I talked to anyone who didn't want the story written. Everyone was very positive. But there isn't an awful lot of lore, and we had to spend quite a time in the National Library in the record of the Sligo estate. One thing about the Sligo estate, they kept records, and they have them. The index to the estate is to the estate papers is in the library in Westport, and the index is 600 pages. So there's a lot of information to be gone through there, and we spent, myself and Peggy spent days and days in the National Library. But there was no, there was great cooperation here, and I got any photographs that were available.
We said Boswell Houston brought in 6,000 sheep. Where did he bring them into, and how did he get them in?
Well, we don't know an awful lot about the imports in the 1850s. But Tommy Cadden in County Crowd, Tommy was alive into the 1970s, and he said that Houston Boswell imported sheep into Bundoora in 1896. He had given up part of the Sligo part of the estate in 95, and he came to an agreement with Sligo, and he imported sheep again in 96. So I presume that William would have brought his sheep into Bundoora. If he brought them into Westport, they'd have the journey out to Dulach or Talabon or Lachta or wherever they were to go to. But if they brought them into Bundoora, they were on their own ground, and they could be rested there for a few days, and then they could be driven to wherever they wanted. So I believe they came into Bundoora. Sheep aren't good swimmers, but they could be thrown off the boat, and if the boat was near the shore, and they'd make their way to the shore.
While doing your research, did you find a draw to go into any of the more historic things in the area? For instance, the Clapper Bridge, the old graveyard at Kinnaduya, how the land got washed away. I think there's an old fort below Wesley Morrison's land. The shipwreck, could that be part of the Armada? Standing stones, etc. Or did you stay focused on what you were started at?
I stayed focused on what I set out to do. It was easy to get distracted, but I managed not to get distracted. I got distracted a couple of times while I was there with other things. In 1916 or 1914 or 2014, we were doing a project down in Newport, and some of the people there said to me, "What are we going to do about 1916?" So we hadn't thought about what we do for 1916, but that put the idea in our head that we'd research the War of Independence and the Civil War in Newport. And we spent a few years at that, and we wrote the book Remember Us, which is a fairly comprehensive account of the War of Independence and the Civil War in the Newport area. Some people said to us like that the Civil War was too sensitive to touch, but we gave an account of the Civil War, and I think people accepted like that we had treated the Civil War fairly, that we hadn't come down on either side. When we had that finished, then Harry Hughes came to me and he said to me that they wanted to do a book on the West Mayo Brigade, the Men of the West, and I spent a couple of more years with Harry and late Vincent Kane and James Kelly on that book. And when we got that done in 22, I came back to that 70 years in the Wild West.
Of course, there is speculation about the fort in Wesley Morrison's land as it seems to grow, whether or not it's actually a fort or where P.T. Morrison keeps his money. Going back to 1973, when you came here, you were a man from the department, as they would deem it. You came in here where people have been doing this system of farming for, we'd say, 50 years. You were trying to change people around from, we'd say, letting all the lambs to the hill. 25% of the wether lambs died before they got to 3 years of age. Letting the old lambs to the hill. You convinced them to do that. Did you go through an enormous pushback? Because obviously it was successful. How hard was it to convince people that this was the right thing to do in 1973? After all, anyone who wasn't local was considered to be a man from the department, which is not
the sheep were never fed when I started work. And because they'd never been trained to eat meat, if they got weak, they wouldn't eat and they'd die of starvation. But I didn't spend all my time in Louisburgh. I was sent across the bay to Ballycroy for a few years, and I got distracted there as well, and I met Peggy. But in 1969, I was upset that you had this huge loss of sheep and lambs, and that people weren't able to do anything about it. So in 1969, I got 2 people to feed meal to their lambs. We fed them a £1/4 pound a day for January and February. John Rice McNulty in Newport, he had been, he said, stuck on 180 ewes. He couldn't get above 180 ewes because above that they dry back. But after he started feeding me, in a couple of years he was up to 250 ewes. Now there was a lot of, we'd say, disbelief at this idea of feeding meal to sheep. And I was always told, you see, that these sheep farmers are very conservative, they won't change. But when the farmers discovered that this feeding the meal to lambs kept them alive and they could get into more sheep, as was a practice that was adopted very fast. See, up till 1950, there was 100 years of hill farming without any change. The ownership of the land changed, but the system of farming didn't. But after the famine, or after the 1950, when meat rationing was abolished in England, and the housewife now had a choice of buying lamb or buying mutton, she bought lamb, and the demand for wether meat dropped. At the same time, synthetic fibres were coming in and replacing wool, and the value of the fleece was falling. So farmers were trying to get out of having a flock of wethers and trying to have a few more ewes and sell the wether lambs. But the wether lambs were too small and they weren't saleable. And we spent a good while encouraging people to manure the land and reclaim it, and that they would have a better and more saleable lamb. I think, well, I have the subject knowledge to catch it. But this, farmers are getting blamed for overgrazing. And there's no doubt about it, but the hills are a lot more heavily grazed than they were 50 years ago. But I think in the 1800s, farmers demanded the 3 Fs. Friction tenure, fair rent and free sale. In the 1970s and the 1960s and 70s, the farmers discovered another 3 Fs. Fencing, feed and fertilizer. They now had 2 pastures, the improved pasture and the hill pasture, and they didn't have to look after the hill pasture the same way as it was before. And the hill pasture could become overgrazed and stock would be taken off and fed on the improved land. So that's how and why the place became overgrazed.
One last question before we hand this to the floor. You've retired 25 years ago, right? So what's the secret for having such energy and still looking like a young fella? Is Tubber Hill the new Ciaran? Go ahead.
I told you that Cadden was good at Plumouth. No, I'm 84. I'm very lucky, I'm in good health, and I haven't any ailments that's disabling me or anything like that. So hopefully we'll get a few more years out of it.